not actually planning to do a reaction today. I had the pre-recorded Teen Girl Squad reaction. I had auto post at midnight. That's all I was gonna do today. Um, but then I saw that this was posted by Food Theory. You would hate this 700-year-old meal in medieval times, and that actually I should close this for a second. That immediately got me interested because one, I love historical videos, and two, I love historical food videos. As you might have guessed, based on the fact that there is a half-watch Tasting History with Max Miller video right there. Um, so this one immediately caught my interest. That one actually got me excited. Um, so I'm curious what his angle is going to be. I mean, this could just as easily be a takedown of like medieval times, the restaurant, which would be disappointing, or maybe he's talking about one specific meal. It got me curious because based on all the things that I've seen, it's not just Max Miller. There's a few other channels, mostly British. The consensus is generally most medieval food was not bad, some was, but usually, like specifically, if you were eating at like the yeoman or even below that, the peasant level, there's a good chance you were going to be eating kind of okay, maybe less meat than you'd like, maybe hungry more nights than you'd like. Um, but like a lot of the dishes for them at the time, at least medieval England, were going to be pretty satisfying. You got your mixes of whatever local fish or rabbit you're able to legally or illegally get your hands on for a larger meal. If you could ignore the grit in your flour, the bread was it was nice whole wheat bread. This kind of stuff we would spend more money on now, um, unless you still think white bread is good. Because that's what the rich people do. They would do this bland white bread. Um, the cleaner the bread, the more expensive the grinding process you could afford. It was a sanction of your wealth. And then you would get vegetables. You would get vegetables. You would get the local herb. You'd get some of that stuff. You get nice little soups. Mushy peas dates back forever. The word which apparently, the single little phrase which apparently makes anyone who's sufficiently British really excited. Mushy peas. Um, Whereas but then if you're eating at the really rich level, it's just all meat, and yeah, you could afford spices, and if you could afford them all, you would overspice everything. That's the problem, really, is that everything is kind of over seasoned, and we kind of know the issue with that. And it's just meat on meat on meat on meat, and you'll get constipated. I get a feeling he's gonna make a reference to how constipated you would get eating rich people's food because it's all bread and wheat. You don't eat vegetables. Vegetables was poor people food. So anyway, that's my non-professional opinion based on what I can remember from watching various YouTube videos. Let's see what MatPat's gonna do here. I should have got my Shadiversity shirt. I got his Castle shirt and his But what about dragons shirt.
Lord, upon what do you wish to dine this evening?
I desire something simple tonight. A hamburger.
A what?
You know, a burger. Ground up beef wadded into a patty and then grilled.
But you said ham.
But it's actually beef. Try to stay with me here, kid. And on the side, I'd like some fried potatoes.
Potato?
Yes, potato! Boil 'em, mash 'em, stick 'em in a stew. Only in this case, I want 'em stuck into a big vat of hot oil. What is so hard about this?
We're not magicians, me lord. We can't make fictional foods.
They're not fictional! They're just across an ocean on a landmass.
I do kind of appreciate that for as much as... And then I also want to check the books now and see if in Lord of the Rings they mention potatoes. Because obviously they mention potatoes in the movies. But like, I mean, the whole point of Lord of the Rings is Tolkien was trying to create a mythology of England. And the Shire, for all he says he hates allegory, tough. His whole book is freaking allegorical at me. I mean, the hobbits are basically middle class Brits. And eating all those potatoes, which they didn't have if this was supposed to be mythological Britain. Incidentally, I think it's the big tell about him is he's trying to create a mythology for Britain, which he feels is absent, but at the same time is both ignoring and drawing from Welsh mythology and Gaelic and Irish mythology, which is right there.
That you don't even know exists yet. It is simple. God, no one is good at their jobs. Greetings upon the internet. Welcome to Ye Oldie Food Theory, the show that strives for the authentic medieval YouTube experience. Remembereth to send your small scribe to ring the towny bell and send a missive to the Lord of Comments, leaving a 5-star review. Yeah, just in case you didn't know, YouTube used to have a 5-star rating system instead of likes and dislikes. The more you know. Okay.
I missed that. I missed the stars. It was better with the stars. It was better with the stars. I like the stars.
So, despite our efforts to be totally historically accurate, it's possible that some things occasionally slip through the cracks, like how YouTube wasn't invented until 2005. Maybe a YouTube video isn't the best place for creating a feeling of ambiance like being in medieval times. But you know what is the best place for creating the ambiance and being in medieval times? Medieval Times! The US-based theme restaurant that transports diners back in time to experience all the food, all the sights, and all the drama of feasting while at a medieval tournament of champions. Authenticity is a key selling feature for this chain. Employees are instructed to almost never break character for any reason. Diners are outright served without silverware to replicate that medieval dining experience. You know what that means, friends? This restaurant was basically one big ol' flashing red sign saying, "Matt Pat, fight me." So, is Medieval Times actually the authentic medieval dining experience? Saddle up, theorists! Today's episode is gonna be a bloodbath. To begin, let's determine where and when the story of Medieval Times is meant to take place. The Medieval Ages, also known as the Middle Ages, are a period of history lasting roughly 1,000 years, starting with the fall of Rome and lasting until the Italian Renaissance. So really, claiming something is medieval is about as non-specific as you get. 1,000 years is
it's a very nebulous thing. I'm kind of on the side of the Crusaders' King times. I usually put it between 870. I also usually put it between 876 and, of course, obviously 1453.
Long time in history. Thankfully, though, we can actually narrow it.
Plenty of debate. I mean, there's plenty of debate for when it starts, but I think there's a pretty good consensus that 1453, despite as specific as it sounds, is like a good ending year, because it's like right around the same time you're getting the printing press. Constantinople falls, which leads directly into all the books and stuff going from there over into Venice, which then gets translated and proliferates around Europe, which is what really inspires the Renaissance. That's the art and culture, and that's specifically getting renaissanced. So yeah, no, and there's like a few other big events that were happening all right around that time. It's a really good end date.
Down to a specific century and region. You see, while medieval time.
Oh, and incidentally, this is your reminder for those of you playing D&D, especially if you're using the main core setting, Forgotten Realms stuff. It's early Renaissance. It is not medieval. You've got rapiers. You've got full plate armor. You've got very much Renaissance style caravels. All the clothing and the buildings that you see in any of the like official artwork or the Baldur's Gate video games, Baldur's Gate 3 specifically. That's all unambiguously Renaissance, and that's without getting into artificers. Obviously, artificers are a whole other thing.
Time seems to be one of the most American-themed restaurants to ever America. Its origins actually trace back to Spain. Back in 1983, Medieval Times' founder, Jose Montaner, converted his family-owned restaurant into a type of dinner theater where audiences could feast while watching his family's history, which traced back to the 11th century. And indeed, it's there in 11th century Spain that the original Medieval Times stories were set.
There was a time, long ago, when a wise king sat upon a mighty throne. For many years, his realm grew and prospered, and the people lived under skies of peace and plenty. Yet there came a day when the rumor of war reached the ear of the king.
Gotta have a
He
falcon.
gathered
I feel like the falcon is the real. For those of you who've gone to medieval times, they always do a falconry thing. I feel like it upstages the horses a little.
his finest knights about him. The day neared its end. The king, his brother the prince, and 6 of his bravest
No, they're the main
knights
character because
repulsed the
they're either
final
wearing a
charge
helmet
of the
or doing
enemy.
anything about their
The day
stupid
was
hair.
won, but with the
This is-
death of the prince,
this is
the
how to
kingdom
play.
was without a champion.
That said, Medieval Times does update its story every few years, so it's possible that they might have migrated forward in time a bit. As such, I'm gonna give them a bunch of wiggle room. Let's say between the years 950 and 1250. This means, even if we're assuming the latest possible date here, Medieval Times still should be happening about 200 years before Columbus sailed the ocean blue, starting the massive cultural and economic upheaval that would eventually be known as the Columbian Exchange. And I call that event out specifically for good reason. You see, it's hard to overstate just how much of a cultural influence the Columbian Exchange had on the world at large. History classes usually only focus on the flow of colonists from Europe to the Americas, but the newly opened trade passages meant that plants,
This borderline feels like a callback to one of his older videos where he talked about just how much he thinks the potatoes changed things. He makes a really good
animals,
argument
diseases,
for it.
and fungi were finding new homes in far-flung corners of the planet as boats and people constantly sailed back and forth across the Atlantic. This meant things like the introduction of brand new ingredients to European chefs. Things like sugar, chocolate, vanilla. All of that came into play in a brand new way and forever changed the way that
Well, sugar they've had access to for forever. They're just getting more of it from this. Sugar goes way back, but it was treated mostly as like medicinal.
recipes were designed. But even existing ingredients would transform as a result of all this. Sure, Europe had things like strawberries before the Columbian Exchange, but they were very small. But then these global explorers suddenly discover massive strawberries just growing in modern-day Chile and Peru. The conquistadors bring them back to Europe and start hybridizing them with the home breeds. Stack on another 600 or so years of innovation, scientific
Now you
discovery,
do.
and selective breeding, and suddenly you have yourself a fruit that would almost be unrecognizable to a medieval European. So just right off the bat, living in the post-Columbian Exchange world is gonna make our food inauthentic tasting. The food that exists today, it's just gonna taste better 9 times out of 10 because our ingredients have the benefit of selective breeding
Yeah,
and
we don't have
engineering.
Sophia.
Also falling into the tastes inauthentic category are the drinks. I promise you, I scoured the internet searching for some kind of scholarly article about 11th century Spaniards adding lemon and lime juice to spring water, thereby creating a proto-Sprite, as it were. But alas, nobody in medieval Europe was drinking anything close to what we'd call a soda.
With Beyond Natural Pet Food, you can
Oop,
feed
need to
your
remember
pet
this
nutrition
point.
as nature intended. Beyond brings you options with natural,
Cut this
organic, and sustainably sourced ingredients
be a
so
long
you
video.
can choose what's best for your pet. Learn more at beyondpetfood.com.
It can be a memory or a feeling.
We did some great stuff out there today.
Some days, you just need it. Comfort for every moment. Snuggle Super Fresh with 5-in-1 odor elimination.
Instead, many of the
And we're
nobility
back.
would have been drinking wine and ale. So let's just start off with the wine, shall we? Modern wine is a triumph
yeah.
of vinting
This
and
is the whole
science that
thing.
would be utterly baffling to even the most masterful winemaker back in the Middle Ages. Yeast, the magic little fungi that digivolves boring old grape juice into palatable alcoholic
This is
wine,
all-
wasn't discovered as an individual organism until 1680. Before then, people had no idea what mechanism actually created the alcoholic flavor and effect. As a result, they would just take rotten grape juice and throw random stuff into it until it tasted okay. Winemaking was just a
It is a little slightly different. Like one thing that does frustrate me with a lot of these historical videos is they all seem to they all kind of go into it with the like assumption that we know that they figured some stuff out. No dilution took forever.
complete gamble here. They were trying anything from other fruit juices to herbs and spices to even powdered marble, trying to make it taste palatable. It was also thicker than the wine of today, so, you know, enjoy drinking your fermented grape sludge fortified with powdered rock. Bottoms up. Similarly, the ale that you could find in medieval taverns would be nothing like modern beer. Almost all modern beers use fresh cloned yeast as their base, which gives them a clean, light finish. Before the discovery of yeast, though, brewers had to rely on dregs from previous batches to serve as a yeast starter for their next brew, a lot like how a mother dough is used to bake sourdough. That means that beer in the medieval era would have had a flat, sour taste. In fact, this method is
But
still
it
used
gets
today,
you
but it's
drunk.
used to create a very specific variety of beer known as exactly that, a sour. Back to the point though, if you really do want the most
I-
authentic medieval beverage,
I don't like the taste of alcohol. I never developed that, so It all sounds the same to me, really.
Experience, just order yourself a sour beer and then let it sit for about an hour or so before you drink it. Beyond that, hops, a key ingredient in most modern beers, didn't become a popular additive until the 12th century, so a bit too late for our purposes today. Hops adds a sharp, bitter taste to the beer, but more importantly, it acts as a preservative, allowing modern beers to have a shelf life of months, whereas medieval beer would have gone bad rather quickly. But even if you actively brewed using old yeast and used no hops, you're still likely getting a much cleaner, lighter tasting beer today, because nowadays we have stainless steel brewing kettles, we have filters, thermometers, clean aged barrels. Compare all of that.
I know Max Miller talked about this, like, way farther back than the medieval periods. He kind of talked about how, like, you know, like the ancient Mesopotamia, early Egypt, then you saw, like, you had beers that were basically almost just like alcoholic porridge because you had so much solids still in them.
To the old wooden kegs and iron pots of ye olde times, and you can see that nowadays it's just a completely different food world. So the beer and wine might have had themselves a radically different taste from the Middle Ages, but at least they would have been there on the table. The food, on the other hand, well, it's just impossible. I couldn't find a single meal on the medieval times menu that was even possible to get in medieval Spain. We'll start off with the very first course for all attendees, tomato bisque. Tomatoes are delicious and are considered to be a staple of modern European foods, especially Italian food. But before the Columbian Exchange, tomatoes weren't available in Europe at all. Tomatoes are indigenous to South America, and as a result, they weren't grown in Britain until the 1590s. Some researchers actually credit the Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortez with bringing the seeds to Europe in 1519. And even then, people were still afraid of them. When Europeans first saw tomato leaves, they recognized them as being related to nightshade, a poisonous plant. That then made Europeans skeptical of eating tomatoes for a long time, meaning that even after
there's all this theory going into, why did they think tomatoes were poisonous? Why did they think tomatoes were poisonous? As much as I like the theory that tomatoes had a high acidity and brought out the lead that was in their plates and cutlery, yeah, it was probably just as simple as the leaves obviously marked them as a nightshade.
The Columbian Exchange, it still took an additional 200 years for tomatoes to actually catch on as a food. That makes the bowl of tomato bisque that starts your medieval times meal about as historically accurate as giving a knight a musket. The next course is probably the most historically...
Actually, that is historically accurate. It was a pretty, I think it was a pretty brief transitionary period from the knights on horseback to the cuirassiers, or however you pronounce that, on horseback, but... Yes, that is historically accurate, Matt. Kind of. I mean, the full plate armor was indicative of the Renaissance time. You got it a little bit towards the end of the medieval times. A little bit, but I mean, it's a huge technological advance. It was coming around the same time as muskets. I mean, unless he means like rifled muskets. I mean, yeah, those came much, much later, but there's more overlap there than I think he's giving it credit for.
Accurate, the salad. Everyone from the lowliest peasants to the richest noble would certainly have eaten their fair share of salads back in the Middle Ages, because meat was just expensive and difficult to produce. As a result, meat was reserved mostly for special occasions unless you were very well off. And even then, the powerful Catholic Church banned eating meat or even animal products on Fridays, Saturdays, and Wednesdays. That's right, in the Middle Ages, even the most powerful of noble was vegan 3 times a week. So a salad isn't out of place here at all. Might as well give medieval times a point for this one, because it is honestly the only point they're getting this episode. Moving on to the main course, we've got ourselves a few options. A half chicken, some barbecue pork ribs, kielbasa sausage, and a vegetarian hummus plate. So let's just go down the line, shall we? The half roasted chicken is probably the most realistic option of the bunch. Chickens first arrived in Europe via trade around 800 BC, so it's perfectly reasonable to think that Europeans were cooking and eating chickens in the 11th century. And because they were relatively easy to raise and slaughter, they presented a viable food option. That said, chickens weren't as common as beef or pork because they required more care and attention than your typical pig or cow. As a result, chickens were often reserved for special occasions like feasts or holidays. Pigs, also viable on the tasting menu. They were domesticated thousands of years ago, so it's not unreasonable to think that our medieval feast would have had some pork ribs.
Yeah, a lot of the ones I get to, they really talk about pig would be a pretty common one to eat. Almost bacon would probably be more likely, just because there's a lot of both cows and chickens and sheep and goats all have an enormous amount of uses besides just eating them. So, you know, if you weren't stupid rich, you weren't going to kill your cow for food unless you really had to. And you definitely weren't going to kill your chickens, who were already making food in the form of eggs, unless you really had to. Same for goats. Sheep were huge if you were in Britain because they made an enormous money on the wool trade. But pigs, that was kind of all you did with them. So they honestly actually get this kind of accurate in the anime and manga light novel series Descendants of a Bookworm. It's a little different because they kind of do some things a little different there, but at the end of the day, it's medieval Germany as seen by Japan. But that was kind of thing. You would slaughter, and then you kind of have almost a year's worth, or at least a good winter's worth. You have so many different bits of meat, and then you have the grease as well that you're going to use for everything, because grease is huge and useful. And you get some leathers out of it. It's not as good as cow's leather, obviously, but you are getting it. There's a lot of use to get from that. So yeah, it could definitely make more sense that you'd be eating pork than chicken. Another thing I think we need to remember is, I think usually, from my vague memories of medieval times, there usually is kind of assumption that we are viewing the joust kind of as guests of the king, so it'd be a little more excused, I think, to get a little more meat in there.
Sure, their
Tomatoes,
barbecue
obviously.
sauce wouldn't have been loaded with sugar and tomato paste like modern barbecue sauces, but they would season their meats with spices and wine, so pretty darn close.
Oh, spices and wines, and then almost definitely like honey and fig. You could get pretty close to a modern barbecue sauce with some of the stuff they had there.
Considering how loose the definition of barbecue sauce can get sometimes, I'm gonna count it. The third choice of meat, though, that right there is the clear deal breaker. The kielbasa sausage was an invention of 14th century Poland, putting it 2 to 3 centuries ahead of where we're at in history. That said, though, sausage itself is ancient, and some form of a sausage dish would have been popular in 11th century Spain. There was a popular Roman pork sausage named lucanica that might have held the top spot in Spain around this time, so not quite kielbasa, but still something close.
Yeah, like specifically kielbasa seems like they're specifically calling it kielbasa because they think it sounds medieval. That is kind of weird, but yeah, sausage seems fine because like I said, sausage goes way back. I don't know. I feel like they're missing a trick to do some like meat pies and stuff like that. That'd be cool.
No, in this case, the vegetarian option is the clear loser of the bunch. The hummus plate, that just ain't happening. On the one hand, dishes involving chickpeas, lentils, lemon juice, and garlic go back for thousands of years. On the other hand, the first recipe known for anything resembling hummus comes from the 13th century. And even then, it is barely what we'd call hummus today. At the end of the process, the 13th century...
I'm curious, I swear Max Miller did some sort of an ancient hummus. I'll have to check.
hummus was rolled thin and then left to dry all night. Doesn't exactly sound like the kind of soft dip that we'd be expecting to get served as part of our kingly feast. But of them all, it's not actually the main part of the main course that makes all of these impossible.
It's a little cake thing, right, that you get at the end. That's what I'm making my prediction now. It's that weird little. I swear it's from like Hostess or something.
It's the side dish, roasted potatoes.
Correct.
Now, when you think of potatoes, you probably think of the
got
Irish, right? The great potato famine that
potatoes.
depopulated the country so badly that it still hasn't been able to recover to a population larger than its 1840 peak. But believe it or not, potatoes didn't originate in Ireland, nor did they originate in Russia where they make vodka this stuff. Instead, the potato has its origins in the Andes Mountains of South America. Yeah, I was shocked by that fact too. Believe it or not,
British.
potatoes didn't make it over to Europe until the late 16th century. It seems crazy to say, but the stereotype of a poor European potato farmer, that's a new stereotype. As recently as 400 years ago, potatoes were still a complete mystery to Europeans. You know what else was a mystery to them? Corn, another staple food item that was introduced to Europe as part of the Columbian Exchange. Jeez, when you look at the food roster here, it seems like all the most delicious stuff was over in the Americas. It's kind of like the worst kind of video game. All the best bits were locked behind this massive paywall. Sure, potatoes are free to grab out of the dirt and you can grow as much corn as you want. You're just gonna need to pay for
Reminds me weirdly of Tears Zoo. They're like just treating it all like a video game. Unfortunately, the corns and breads were locked behind the America DLC.
Fleet of ships capable of crossing the ocean before you can get to any of this stuff. So basically everything they give you at medieval times is not the accurate Middle Ages dining experience that they advertise it being. But you know what's even more ironic? Even the stuff they don't give you.
He just said some of the stuff was good, and then he said everything wasn't. You said the ribs were fine.
Is inauthentic. At medieval times, one of the main selling features is this lack of silverware. Sure, you can ask
Yeah.
for some if you need it, but the venue sells this idea that you can just eat with your hands like they did back in the olden days. Except, that's just not true. Sure,
Yeah.
forks were fairly rare in Europe before the 14th century, but knives and spoons? Those things were everywhere. Most people would regularly
To be fair though, I get like I would not feel safe running a children's venue and giving people knives but not forks. Just that level of stabilization.
use a knife with their meal for cutting, and a wooden spoon for eating things like soup. Sure, they would use their hands more often than a modern diner, but it wasn't like medieval peasants had never seen cutlery before. But beyond that, medieval times pretends that all its audience members are nobles, and are therefore getting the best treatment.
Right? He just said you just said, oh, you wouldn't eat chicken that often unless you were rich. Now so he's like, well, you're all nobles, so of course you're getting the chicken. Come on, chicken and ribs
If
are
that's
fine.
the case, it would have been expected in the Middle Ages for you to bring your own cutlery to a dinner engagement in a box called a cadenna. This would then give you a chance to
this is
show
new
off the
information for
fancy
me.
knife and
I like
spoon
this.
that you had specially made up for you. If you were wealthy enough, these items may have been made of silver or even gold, while poor merchants trying to look richer than they were would get themselves a lead fork wrapped in gold leaf. So on the one hand, it's not very authentic to have no silverware on the table in medieval times. On
Really
the other
relying
hand,
on
it
that,
is
gold
authentic
leaf.
not to offer that silverware in general. That said, something tells me that the heavily armed security of medieval times might not appreciate me bringing a box with my own personal knife into a public space. Some people just don't appreciate historical accuracy. So, medieval times. The drinks are radically different. The recipes include items that wouldn't have even been known to people in the continent, and even their famous silverware policy is historically dubious. But honestly, if it means that I'm not having to drink a mouthful of powdered marble, I'm okay with that.
This is medieval time.
Great place to party.
And disco after the show.
Disco? They were encouraging you to disco after your jousting tournament? With that commercial air. 1990? Oh boy, medieval times just missed all the time periods. But hey, all this talk about stale medieval mead has really gotten me thirsting for the sponsor of today's.
Okay, we're not going to worry about that. I'm going to say what he really missed was what I think the biggest thing medieval times is missing, and that's trenchers. Which is, you used to eat on a... your plate was basically made out of bread. And we would just sop all the juices like Ethiopian food, which is incidentally probably my favorite kind of food. If you haven't tried Ethiopian food, go try Ethiopian food. It's very, very different. You know, it's a very different kind of bread than what Ethiopians eat on, because the teff flour is very sour. But you ate on this big thing of bread, and you know what? You know, if you were being a good Christian, whatever, in medieval times, and you were a noble, you didn't get to eat the trencher. You'd give out the trencher to the poor. That's what an alm was. Alms for the poor. So that would be like the most awesome thing ever, to be historically inaccurate. Give me the experience of being a noble in ancient medieval times, and give me some really saucy chicken and ribs, and then let me eat the trencher at the end. I think that's the big missing. Okay, that was neat. I'd prefer if it wasn't medieval times that they're talking about, but it meshed with the kind of things I was interested in, and I learned a few new things about the box for the silverware. So okay, have fun. If you enjoyed this, if you found my personality likable, then go ahead, please check out the rest of my videos. I mostly react to, right now at least, who knows what's going to happen in the future. At the moment, though, I'm pretty much mostly just reacting to Homestar Runner videos, those classic strong bed emails. Whenever you're watching, I think Josh Scorcher is the most likely one to occasionally throw out a reference to some Trogdor strong bed there. You're like, what's going on there? It's this old pre and early YouTube series thing. So go ahead and check out my reactions to it. So yeah, just like, comment, subscribe. By all means, comment all the things I was getting wrong. Go ahead. At me.